Hello, this is Future Conversations with Emerging Future Institute. I'm joined, my name is Benjamin J Butler. I'm a futurist, and I'm joined today by Steve McDonald, a futurist based in Australia. And today, I think, connecting from Switzerland, perhaps. Yeah.
Yep.
And Kingsley Dennis, an author with a profound interest in the future, and has written books on all sorts of interesting topics, from science fiction to consciousness. So this is a new show we're starting every week, an informal get-together of some future thinkers around the planet. And I guess it's a conversation to sort of join what's topical today with some of the bigger trends and scenarios that we've been discussing. So it's really come out of a spin-off of a conversation that we've been having for some time now, a group of us speaking across the globe, and we thought it'd be useful to try and record part of it. So thanks, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thanks, Benjamin.
You're welcome, Benjamin.
So we're just going to give our impressions, sort of informal impressions of what's happened in the last week, what's topical, what strikes us, and then we'll see where we go from there. I've had an interesting week. I sort of had a little bit of a news blackout over the weekend, and I've been catching up, but a lot's happening. We get closer to a Kim Jong-un Trump summit in Asia. I think that's big. I think that it's not just about a small nation in the midst of Asia, East Asia. It's all the major powers are involved in that fault line, as a geopolitical strategist might say. And there's probably some big grand bargain going on behind the scenes with China. I think that we've seen in the last couple of weeks the Americans administration up in the ante on the trade disputes across the globe with China, and even with, surprisingly, even with partners such as Europe and Mexico and Canada. It seems to me it's part of a bigger renegotiation, a sort of pivot behind the scenes. Financial markets haven't reacted to it, surprisingly. I think perhaps some people don't think that the White House is serious, or that Trump will pull back from the brink. I think that he is pretty serious, but probably is part of a bargaining process. What else have we seen? I'm concerned about Europe. I think the long game, whilst a lot of people are hoping for a Brexit to be renegotiated, I think the fragility of the EU economy is not fully understood, and that it's becoming increasingly evident. And we've had sort of a lot of problems with the Italian bond market in recent weeks. I'm not saying a much bigger crisis, EU-wide crisis, is imminent, but I ultimately think it will happen. It struck me that there's large capital flows coming out of the EU at the moment, and I think that there is smart money that's worried about trends there. Even money coming out of the euro into the pound sterling, which is rather ironic. And lots of interesting social trends around the world. I thought it was funny that Simon Cowell, the big public figure, I guess, in the UK and US, made headlines this week for saying that he didn't use his phone for 10 months. And as Kingsley told me earlier today, probably he could get away with it because his entourage were carrying phones. But I think it brings the issue to the surface. And my take on that is like Facebook and all the surveillance stuff. I think we've had these breakthrough technologies, the internet, and then we've had mobile, smartphone, and we really didn't know how to use them like any tool. And we've used them inefficiently. I'm convinced that many of the economists around the world have been trying to figure out why productivity has collapsed in the last couple of decades. And I'm always surprised when I look at their academic papers, they don't talk about the internet and how lots of dissatisfied employees are probably just surfing the net for large percentages of the day. I think we're just getting used to these tools, and I see anecdotally and in the news more and more people experimented with how to engage and when to disengage from technology. Certainly, I myself I've done experiments like Simon Cowell, and I don't have hundreds of millions of dollars stashed away in some Swiss bank account, sadly, and my experiments actually were quite good. I had a very good experience not having a phone for months at end. So lots going on in the world. We can pick up some of those themes, I'm sure. Interested in if either of you have got a view on John McAfee's potential presidential bid in the United States. They're all lining up now. I guess Howard Schwartz from Starbucks is also possibly a contender as well. And yeah, that's me for my first check-in. Steve, what are your thoughts?
So we're in the middle of a paradigm shift from what has been the dominant global paradigm, the modern scientific, industrial, corporate era, to a community-oriented new paradigm, which I'm calling relativistic, decentralized, humanistic. And the new paradigm is essentially driven by the need for real human connection, whereas the old paradigm, the modern paradigm, was driven very much by individual success, the desire for individual success. So it's a very different kettle of fish. And the new paradigm, which is rising, is very reactive to the perceived problems created by life according to the modern paradigm, the old paradigm. And some of the trends associated with the new paradigm are certainly community building at all scales, and particularly rebuilding local communities, the decentralization of power. We're seeing that in the whole blockchain movement, of course, the relocalization of industry. And there are a number of factors playing into that, including simply being able to trust and know where your products come from. Certainly in terms of food production, that's important. And new technologies like, for example, 3D printing, which are going to allow local manufacturing at very, very reduced cost and cut out the need for long supply chains and those sorts of things. Other trends include great concern for ecology and our impact on the planet and finding ways to reduce that. And as I said a minute ago, this desire for real human connection. So the technology produced by the modern paradigm has allowed us to access people all around the world and communicate very easily, but it's actually reduced our real human connection, our face-to-face connection. And I think that's going to be a driving factor in the development of new technology once the new paradigm becomes dominant, is bringing it back to actual real contact. At this very moment, we being in the middle of this paradigm shift, we're subject to what is called a slingshot effect, where once the old paradigm's effectiveness begins to break down and people realize at a personal level that this old way of living isn't working, they go on a regressive search for a set of values that will work. And that takes us back to older sets of values. And we're seeing that play out at a global level with politicians returning to very simple black and white thinking and values which were more prominent many, many years ago. And in an evolutionary sense, the reason for that regression is to create increased tension, which actually speeds up the evolutionary progress. So by going backwards to old values, those old values are even worse than the modern paradigm values in terms of solving our complex problems. and so that will accelerate the desire for change across society. It's the evolutionary mechanism behind that. Yeah, and I guess on a political level, I'm certainly seeing the decline of the US empire, and Trump seems to have a key role to play there. I'm seeing him as being like the archetypal fool from the tarot card deck, where he's quite naive and childlike in terms of his attitudes, and that means that he won't hesitate to challenge things that perhaps more mature-minded politicians would hesitate to challenge, simply because he's not thinking of the deeper strategic issues in terms of his own support. So that actually means he's much more likely to be able to deconstruct the US empire and its reach than anyone else might have done, someone like Obama, for example. And yeah, on a wider scale, I can also see the EU seems to be in decline. Certainly our financial systems are less effective, our political systems are less effective across the board. But at the same time, we've got this new paradigm rising, so it's easy to get stuck on the stuff that's not working. There's also some amazing technology, including blockchain and cryptocurrency, and lots of other interesting technologies rising as well. So I think it's a good time to be looking at what's new and supporting the rise of the new world.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Kingsley, what are you seeing this week?
Well, thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Steve. Well, looking at the past week, I think it shows that we're kind of all over the place. We are definitely at almost a precedented moment, and we're seeing that the kind of linear understanding that we once had of the world, the empiric unipolar world, is just so far gone now. And geopolitics is, there are literally eruptions all over the place on what we may call disruptive innovations. So we have, of course, the Trump making waves and making a lot of backlash amongst his own people, and there are parties coming together trying to challenge him. And also we see that I think Europe is definitely in a kind of fragmentation or a fracturing. So just this week in Spain, for example, we've had the Prime Minister Rajoy being ousted through a no confidence vote because of a huge corruption scandal. And so the opposite party, which is the socialist, PSOE, get in power by de facto, but people have no real trust in them either. And so I think this is the kind of pattern, because again, the last week or so, we've had the Italian politics again trying to struggle to maintain some kind of coalition. And what we've seen in Europe is that where once before you had singular parties governing, we're now going back to the need for looking for dubious alliances and coalitions. So not only in Italy, also we saw it in Germany, where Merkel had to make a coalition with a party that she was not in bed with previously, so to speak. Even in the UK, May had to make an alliance with the Northern Ireland Party just to maintain her, her majority. And so therefore she's now compromised in making decisions over Brexit because of the Irish soft border question. So when you have these coalitions coming into play, you compromise the ability for politicians to make straightforward decisions, because they have to negotiate. And also the pattern in Europe is that a lot of far right or center right parties are coming to the populist parties that are coming to power, representing a kind of populist wave through the general masses. So this is also kind of fracturing the belief or the intention of the European Union to be a kind of singular, unified, visionary bloc. So also we're seeing a lot of the continuation of the demonization of Russia, or the Russia baiting, which is a mixture of disinformation, propaganda, and normal political news or propaganda. And so Russia are continuing to have their allegiance with Europe. In fact, Putin is visiting Austria, I believe, this week. But what Europe is not talking about is they have a huge reliance on Russian gas coming in. So on the surface, they're saying one thing. Underneath it, they need their certain kind of interdependencies. So this geopolitics, nobody really knows what's going on outside. I'm not even sure inside, but outside they're continuing, or I think they're even amplifying their divisive rhetoric. But underneath, there's lots of dependencies or codependencies that need to be continued to maintain a very much a global interconnected world. So the rhetoric and reality are not coming together. They're not making a cohesion. And that's one problem. And also, I think on the social technological basis, you mentioned Simon Cowell making a valid statement about the phone. Whether it's valid in practicality, the issue is that he's making a credible statement, is that technologies, we may need to readopt or reevaluate how we are using them, because they really have got a kind of, we've been in bed with them in a way that we can't continue. And also interestingly, I thought that yesterday, the infamous Kim.com made the offer to come together with Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and the European hackers group to make a co-development of a new social network that he wants to be a kind of replacement for what he called, in his words, the deep state social networks of Facebook and Twitter. So I think that, this idea that there are some big names now coming together and calling for alternative social media platforms that they say will have greater trust. So I think what is going to be a pattern is this issue of trust between what the mainstream institutions are saying and what is on the ground, or what is going through the decentralized networks or the social consciousness. Because now, with the political fragmentation and this disinformation and propaganda, I think there's a real loss of trust in these institutions. And so I think there's going to be a lot of kind of renegotiation of these decentralized networks trying to create their parallel or alternative programs or platforms to try to call upon the trust from the people. So I think that this outer fragmentation of the geopolitical scene and is also going to play out a lot in the social consciousness about wanting to find our own islands of trust within the sea of distrust or sea of disinformation. And I think we're going to see more and more news coming out like this. And again, people trying to find new ways to use technologies for social betterment, because we've had the honeymoon period, we've had the wonderful smartphones, we've had all the wonderful apps that bring us together, but now we realize that the same apps that bring us together can also monitor our calls, monitor our data, our information. So, it's not so good after all. So the social trust in the honeymoon of our technology is perhaps over. And I think so many kind of different parts are now in play that really is difficult to know what we're going to see in the future. I think we're going to see more of coming together, going apart in order to come together in a different new way. So they're my thoughts, Benjamin.
Yeah, some great points. Well, let's pick up on decentralization, trusts, and technology, and then we can come back. Maybe we've all spoken a little bit about geopolitics as well. And we can come back to that afterwards. I think you're absolutely right. In a way, 2016 was perhaps this sort of slingshot move in many senses of the word, because the sort of war in tribal nature of social media got so bad in 2016. I think people are starting to move the other way now, and we're having various people trying to come up with alternative technologies. Some people just getting off social media or trying to use it in a different way. I noticed, I was on YouTube the other day, and I noticed someone flagging the fact that their channel was also going to either move or list on a new site that was going to be launched soon, a more decentralized version of YouTube, and a sort of libertarian-based one. I find it all very encouraging. The founders of the internet really they didn't envisage a small group of big monopoly companies controlling the entire information on the internet. So I think we'll look back and see this Mark Zuckerberg having testimonies in Congress and the European Parliament as perhaps one manifestation of a turning point.
Yeah, I agree. Kingsley, you mentioned the fragmentation within politics, and I'm certainly seeing that in many other countries as well. And I see that as a part of this decentralization trend. So the centralization of power just doesn't work anymore because of the tremendous complexity and variety of matters that need to be brought to the table. And so even the major political parties are finding that the hierarchy is breaking down, and they're having to pull together these coalitions of some quite different mindsets at times. So I think that's a really nice example of decentralization, at a lower level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, talking about the media and the centralization of power in the internet with the 4 or 5 major companies. That's always been the case in the media communications industry, all the way back from the cable, the radio, then the TV. That they started off as smaller companies, and larger mergers came across and just swallowed them up. And I think there was a mix of naivety when the internet came along, because it gave all the ability for people to be decentralized and everything. But the same old paradigm came in and used the same model to try to centralize it. And so now we have that awareness that, they're playing the same game on a new playing field, which is the internet. So I think, a lot of people didn't see it happening, but perhaps they should have. But on the other hand, the internet is unlike any other communication system because it's peer-to-peer. It's so distributed thereby we can create alternatives. It's difficult in terms of the older media industries to create a lot of alternatives. There are small cable channels, there are small kind of their own TVs. But so I think the advantage of the new model, which is a decentralized system of the internet, is that once you see the monopoly coming, you can create something that goes against it in time. So I think that we've had, again, this naivety or the honeymoon period, and now we're going to see some real innovative, creative alternatives coming up because they just don't want the old model anymore.
And that same pattern is also playing out in the blockchain cryptocurrency world, where the technology has been rolled out and the modern mindset is coming in and trying to play its old strategic games to control the new technology. So it's basically the same thing that happened with the internet.
Mm.
Yeah. So,
and of course, I've got to mention John McAfee's throwing his hat into the ring for the 2020 presidential election. I guess everyone's lining up now. You've had the founder of Starbucks suggesting he might enter the ring. I'm not so sure about his chances, but I guess he's a businessman, so perhaps he feels that he might be able to go up against Trump if American people are looking for business people nowadays, as opposed to just sort of talkers or politicians. I'm not sure he's going to speak to Middle America. On coastal America, people might love the sort of progressive policies of Starbucks and the fact that they closed their stores the other day to do diversity training. But I think in Middle America, they associate Starbucks with $5 lattes and progressive politics. So we'll see. Anything's possible. I think McAfee's kind of interesting in that even if he doesn't win, it brings a new voice. I guess he said he's trying to represent the sort of crypto community, libertarian crypto community. Steve, you said you started to watch his video.
Yeah, I just watched a 5-minute promo video that he's put out for his apparent presidential campaign, and he's presenting himself as a Dirty Harry kind of character. With cigars and guns, talking about drugs and those sorts of things. And I think talking about this slingshot effect that we're seeing, where values are regressing to older, more simple values, which is bringing out the right-wing elements. I think he's trying to jump on that bandwagon. He's seeing the rise of what looks like the rise of right-wing values, which ought to be a temporary thing during this slingshot effect. He probably doesn't see that as being temporary. He probably thinks it's a longer term trend and wants to jump on the bandwagon, present himself as a tough guy who knows what's going on, and has a lot of common sense, and certainly very much appealing to the working class, as a potentially strong leader who won't muck around and will get things done.
And the one of the positive sides of this is that the cat's out the bag, so to speak, is that now I think people are realizing that you don't only have to be a career politician to actually run for a political position. Whereas before, everyone knew that you needed X amount of money, you needed X amount of backing by the big players, you needed to go through the right kind of education and the right kind of elite schooling, otherwise you wouldn't have a chance. And Trump has actually shown that, okay, he's got money, he's got etc., but actually he's not a career politician in any way or form. And that now is opened the door for other people to think, well, he can do it, I can do it. And I think in the long term, I think that will also impact in a positive way about the younger generations, because a lot of young people have been put off. They don't want to run for politics, even though they want to try to make a better world, because they're not career politicians. They're not in that mindset. They don't want to go through the whole kind of, very, very kind of rigid vetting process, more or less. But if they can feel that there's an opportunity for people who have capacity but don't necessarily have to go through the career path to be a politician, it's going to encourage them. So I think that's good that now this door is open to other possibilities in the political spectrum.
And a really, really good point. And maybe we'll see that replicated in other countries. It'd be great if we saw it in the UK. I'm pinning my hopes more on decentralisation, and I've seen some great cases in the UK of local councils taking back power and independents running in local councils. But it'd be great if we had sort of outside mavericks running for office in Westminster. I want to change topics. This really only time for this one last topic. But so Steve mentioned the end of the American empire, and that Trump was perhaps accelerating that. So here's my thing. I've always regarded myself as a sort of contrarian thinker, and for the last few years, I have constantly heard about the end of the US. I've been sitting in Asia I've been living between Asia, US, and I guess Europe for 20 years. Enjoyed and was amazed by the rise of China. Saw China join the WTO in 2002. Became very optimistic myself, and I've become now more skeptical about, or at least very aware of the challenges that China will face, and all the people that like to extrapolate trends from the last 5-10 years are now suggesting that China will overtake the US within just a few years now. Personally, I don't see it happening, and my inner contrarian. There's a big caveat to everything I'm saying now, but I'll get to that. I see one of the big potential surprises is the comeback of the US, and it's not necessarily make America great again, but I think there are positive things happening with the United States today. I just did an interview with an investor based in Hong Kong, Zhong Li, which we're publishing this week as well, and he's very keen on this idea, or is seeing it himself. He invests across the United States as well as Asia, re-onshoring back to the US as supply chains get shorter, as people want to buy local. I was reading another survey of millennials who are increasingly becoming the dominant economic group around the planet. They often want to buy locally produced food, organic, craft, etc., etc. 3D printing is going to come along, and all this decentralized technology. So in that sense, I can see an awakening of Middle America, or what did they call it before the election? They used to call it flyover zone, didn't they? The bits of America in between California and the East Coast. So I'm optimistic about the possibilities there. I also think and thought when Trump came in that in a sort of a madman sort of way, a la Henry Kissinger's theory that the best geopolitical strategist is someone that's kind of unpredictable and at times bordering on the irrational. That Trump's playing that role, and maybe who knows whether it's his strategy or he's playing out someone else's strategy. But what I can see is something that perhaps if I was operating in the old paradigm of geopolitics, I indeed might do. The scales towards Asia had gone too far. Legitimately, some Americans might feel their countries became the consumer of last resort, that they've been let down by their large multinational companies who moved all their operations overseas and cut their costs massively. And so you saw margins expand. And so Wall Street's done very well for many years because these large corporations have cut costs. Anyway, I just wonder. I just feel that in a traditional sense, this renegotiating of terms vis-a-vis Asia and now vis-a-vis Europe is actually something done by intelligent design, not necessarily Trump himself, mind you. And it was interesting. A friend of mine from California who was very, very successful technologist, but very against Trump during the election. I met her in London recently, and even she said to me, "You know what? I still don't like him, but I worked in China, and she ran a big operation in China briefly, and she said maybe we just needed this kind of bull in a china shop to give us an excuse to push back against China." So here's my big caveat to all of that, is that my hope is that regardless, it's not about empires anymore. That even if all the Western journalists are right about China I'll rephrase that. That it's not going to be, the next empire won't be China. It won't be America passing the baton to China. It won't be necessarily a resurgence of the American empire. That the American empire could end, and the distasteful dimensions, the military aspects, having 800 military bases around the world, and the centralization, all of that could potentially end, and America itself could flourish in a decentralized world. And that's kind of my hope.
Yeah, I think you could be quite right there. Certainly all the main trends of the rising paradigm, this new relativistic decentralized paradigm, run against the continuing existence of a centralized global power, and also run against the fundamental principles of how the US has been operating, both domestically and internationally. So I think that's got to change. The timing, of course, is always very difficult to predict, and many people would remember that there was a big upsurge of these new decentralized relativistic values back in the 1960s and early 70s, and that was very quickly squashed down by the dominant paradigm back then. So whether they'll stick this time is a question mark. But I think that there's sufficient new technology to create a scaffold or a framework for this new worldview to actually become globally dominant. I agree with you, Benjamin, that it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the USA. It just means that the power structure and the way that power is distributed is very likely to change.
Yeah, I'm still. I still am impressed by American ingenuity and talent when I spend time in Europe as well. But I think America still has a lot going for it, and I think the West generally is going through its dark night of the soul, and in some ways we're ahead of Asia, because Asia's not going through its dark night of the soul.
I agree, and it's interesting to look at these paradigm shifts, and there always seems to be a not an exact synchronization, but like a 180-degree difference between the West and the East. You know, I think it seems like the West goes through change first and the East follows in some respects, and there are probably other aspects of society where it's the opposite. So, you know, I mean, you could argue that China is just entering into its modern scientific industrial era, albeit within a different set of global conditions than the US did hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, from my perspective, Benjamin, Steve, I would say that the age of empires is over, has been for a while. We no longer have been operating in a unipolar kind of energy or phase. We're just seeing the last traces, the last vestiges of an empiric model. And, you know, if we can say anything about Trump, is that at least with him, it's not business as usual. And if Clinton had won the election, I think she would have pushed for business as usual because she was a system player. And so it would have been America trying to maintain as much as possible the same recipe that they've been doing for so long. So they would have been trying to maintain the old model against a change, which would have seen other frictions come into play. Now, yeah, there are a lot of indications that China are going to, overreach America in terms of certain, financial exporting and the GDP, even on the AI development. Now, that may be so, but in terms of quantity, it doesn't actually mean that they're going to be the global player. I agree with you. I don't feel that China is going to be the next empire because the age of empires is over. And also China, historically, if you look at China over the many millennia, they've never actually gone to the point where they want or they've taken global power. They've gone out, they've outreached, but often they came to a point where they then actually contracted back because China has a mentality and a pattern, a consciousness that they want to maintain a very much an interior sense of identity. So although they go out, they often reach a point and they come back in. Historically, we've seen that over the millennia. Now, I think what's going to happen is that although China is going to be a very major player and may quantitatively be one of the biggest players, they're going to actually work in associations and collaborations with other countries because the world just cannot, because it's so interdependent, it cannot longer sustain an empire or a nation trying to play an empire. So I think you're right that America could still hold its own, but there are going to be a lot of going back to the kind of artisan models, people producing and reaching the consumer directly because of their communication channels. They can sell directly to the consumer. There are going to be 3D printing. If that's going to happen in America, it's going to happen in many developed countries as well and developing countries. So we're not only going to see research in America, I think we're going to see research in many countries who are going to operate upon trying to look back at a kind of domestic resurgence. And also in this picture, I think we also should give a kind of eye to South America. South America, I think, still has a lot of room to develop and they have a lot of resources because they've been held back through mostly political corruption, which they're trying to flush out. Brazil now is flushing out a lot of corruption. They've indicted Lula, they've indicted a lot of the major politicians and judiciary. Chile is developing strongly as well. So I think that we're going to see Russia developing Eurasia with contact with China. We're going to see a lot of the South American countries coming up. It's going to be a multipolar world. And at the same time, underneath that geopolitical kind of development, I think we're going to see a lot of action on the ground between people trying to develop artisan models, new working structures outside of the working for your life with a company 9-to-5 office, trying to develop more kind of autonomous ways and means of living, which is really going to change the system a lot from within. So that's kind of what I'm seeing from my perspective.
Great. No, I think very well said. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your time, and hope we can do this again soon.
Thanks, Benjamin. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. Thanks, Steve.